single dad was fired for repairing a woman's car for free. Days later, he found out who she was. The garage behind Daniel Fletcher's house had always been his escape, a place where the smell of engine oil and old metal drowned out the silence of a home that still felt too empty after 3 years. Fixing cars after hours wasn't his job. It was the one thing that reminded him he could still build something with his own hands, still help someone without needing permission from a timesheet or a corporate policy. That Friday night, when he saw a woman stranded in the rain with a dead battery, he didn't think twice, just grabbed his tools and did what felt right. 20 minutes later, she offered to pay, and he waved her off with a tired smile. "It's just a hobby. I'm glad I could help." What he didn't see was the photo, taken from across the street, grainy but clear enough. Him standing next to her car, talking, smiling like they'd known each other for years. 3 days later, his manager called him into the office with that photo on the desk, and Daniel's 15 years of loyalty ended in a single sentence. "We believe you've been sharing company plans with a competitor." Daniel had built his life around 2 things: his daughter Sophie and his work. Everything else was just noise filling the gaps his wife left behind when cancer took her 3 years ago. The morning routine never changed. Wake at 5:30, make Sophie's lunch with the crusts cut off the way she liked, drop her at school by 7:15. Then drive to TechFlow Automotive, where he'd spent the last 15 years designing transmission systems that most people would never notice, but that kept their cars running smooth. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and steady was what Sophie needed. A 12-year-old girl who'd already lost her mother didn't need more uncertainty in her life. The garage had been his wife's idea, back when she was still well enough to tease him about spending more time with carburetors than with people. "You light up when you're fixing things," Sarah had said one Saturday afternoon, watching him rebuild an old Chevy engine he'd picked up at a yard sale. Her voice had that particular warmth it always carried when she was about to say something that would stay with him forever. "Maybe when I'm gone, that's how you'll remember to be happy again." He'd told her not to talk like that, had set down his wrench and pulled her close, feeling how thin she'd become under the oversized sweater she wore to hide the weight loss. But she'd just smiled, that knowing smile she had, the one that said she understood things he was still trying to avoid, and kissed his oil-stained knuckles. "Promise me you won't stop fixing things, Dan. Not cars, not people, not yourself." After she passed, the garage became sacred ground. He'd kept everything exactly as it was that last Saturday they'd spent together. The Chevy engine still sat half-assembled on the workbench. Her coffee mug with the faded "World's Okayest Wife" print still hung on the pegboard where she'd left it. Sometimes late at night when Sophie was asleep, he'd come out here and just sit in the old camping chair Sarah used to occupy, and if he closed his eyes, he could almost hear her laugh, could almost smell the jasmine perfume she wore, could almost believe she was just inside getting them both another beer. That Friday night in November, Daniel was wiping down his tools when he heard the sound, an engine trying and failing to turn over, that distinctive click-click-click of a dead battery cutting through the rain. He stepped out onto his driveway and saw a black sedan stopped under the streetlight 2 houses down, hazard lights blinking weakly. A woman in a business suit was standing beside it, phone pressed to her ear, frustration clear in the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot. He grabbed his toolbox and walked over without thinking about it. The same way he'd stopped to help someone pick up dropped groceries or hold a door open. It was just what you did. It was what Sarah had loved about him, what she'd made him promise not to lose. She looked up as he approached, wariness flickering across her face before she managed a polite smile. "Car trouble?" Daniel asked, and she nodded, tucking a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "Battery's dead. I've been trying to reach roadside assistance for 20 minutes, but apparently everyone in the city decided to break down tonight." Her voice had that particular edge of someone used to solving problems quickly, who'd just run into one that wouldn't cooperate. Daniel set his toolbox down and popped her hood. "I've got jumper cables in my garage. Give me 2 minutes." She started to protest, something about not wanting to impose. But he was already jogging back to his driveway. The rain was coming down harder now, cold enough to sting, but he barely noticed. The jump took less than 15 minutes. While they waited for her battery to charge, she made small talk, asked if he lived nearby, how long he'd been working on cars. Daniel kept his answers simple, pleasant, but not inviting more conversation than necessary. She seemed nice enough, professional, the kind of person who probably had an important job and a busy life that didn't include standing in the rain waiting for strangers to fix her car. When the engine finally caught and purred to life, relief washed over her face. She reached for her purse, asking what she owed him, and he waved her off. "Nothing. It's just something I do after work. Keeps my hands busy." She hesitated, like people always did when you didn't want their money, then extended her hand. "I'm Morgan." He shook it briefly. "Daniel, drive safe." She thanked him again, got in her car, and pulled away into the rain. He thought that was the end of it. Just another random moment of decency in a world that didn't have enough of them, the kind of thing Sarah would have been proud of him for. He went back to his garage, finished cleaning up, and stood for a moment looking at that half-assembled Chevy engine. "Still keeping my promises," he said quietly to the empty space, then headed inside to check on Sophie, who was already asleep with her math homework still spread across her desk. He straightened the papers, pulled her blanket up over her shoulders, and let himself just watch her breathe for a minute. She looked so much like Sarah when she slept. Same delicate features, same way her hair fell across her cheek. He brushed it back gently and went to bed, thinking about the transmission redesign he needed to present on Monday. Monday morning arrived the way it always did. Coffee, breakfast, Sophie chattering about a science project on ecosystems, while he nodded and made sure she ate her eggs. But this morning she was quieter than usual, pushing her food around her plate. "Dad?" she said finally, not looking at him. "Are we okay? Like, money-wise?" Daniel set down his coffee cup, studying her face. "Why are you asking that?" She shrugged, still not meeting his eyes. "I heard you on the phone with the insurance company last week. You sounded worried." His chest tightened. He'd tried so hard to keep those calls private, to shield her from the constant juggling act of medical debt from Sarah's final months and regular bills, and trying to save for Sophie's future. "We're okay, kiddo, I promise." She finally looked up at him, and those brown eyes that were so much like her mother's held a skepticism too old for 12. "You always say that." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Because it's always true. We're a team, remember? Teams stick together." She seemed to accept that, or at least pretended to, and let him drive her to school with the radio playing the pop music she liked, and he pretended not to. He dropped her at the front entrance, watched her join her friends, and sat there for a moment after she disappeared inside, wondering when his daughter had started worrying about things that should only be his burden. Sarah would have known what to say, how to reassure her without diminishing her concerns. Sarah had always been better with words, with emotions, with the soft skills of parenting. He was just doing his best to keep them both afloat. He drove to TechFlow's parking lot and walked through the glass doors into the lobby with its sterile white walls and motivational posters about innovation and teamwork. His desk was on the 3rd floor, tucked into a corner of the engineering department, where the fluorescent lights hummed and the air conditioning ran too cold year-round. He'd just set down his coffee when his phone buzzed with a message from his manager, Richard Harrison. "My office." Now. The tone wasn't unusual. Harrison had always been abrupt. All business. The kind of manager who measured your value by how many problems you solved without bothering him. But something about the timing felt off. The walk down the hallway felt longer than usual. Harrison's door was open, but his expression was closed. the kind of look that meant whatever conversation was about to happen wasn't going to be pleasant. Sitting in the chair beside Harrison's desk was Janet Morse from HR, her face professionally neutral, and that's when Daniel knew this wasn't about a project update. Daniel sat down in the remaining chair, and Harrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. He turned his computer monitor around so Daniel could see the screen. It was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough. Daniel standing next to a black sedan in the rain, talking to a woman in a business suit. Both of them smiling like old friends catching up. The timestamp in the corner read, Friday, 8:47 in the evening. Care to explain this? Harrison's voice was flat, administrative, the tone of someone who'd already made up his mind and was just going through the motions. Daniel stared at the photo, confusion mixing with the first cold trickle of dread. I helped someone jumpstart their car. It was outside my house. I didn't know her. Harrison leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. That's Morgan Rivers, CEO of Tech Vantage Industries, our primary competitor, the company that's been trying to poach our engineers for the last 2 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel's brain struggled to catch up, replaying the brief interaction, the casual conversation, her thanks, his refusal of payment. Nothing about it had seemed significant. Nothing about it had felt like anything other than basic human decency. I swear I didn't know who she was, Daniel said, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice and hating it. She was just someone who needed help. Harrison slid a piece of paper across the desk, Daniel's employment contract, with certain sections highlighted in yellow. Non-compete clause, confidentiality agreement, prohibition against unauthorized contact with competitor personnel. You signed this 15 years ago, Daniel. You know the rules. Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest, a hollow space where certainty used to be. I was fixing a stranger's car in my own driveway. That's it. I didn't share anything. I didn't even know her name until she told me, and even then, it didn't mean anything to me. Janet Morse cleared her throat, her voice carefully modulated. Mr. Fletcher, we understand this may seem harsh, but TechFlow has a responsibility to protect its intellectual property and maintain clear boundaries with competitor organizations. The optics of this situation are problematic, regardless of intent. Daniel turned to her. The optics? I helped someone in the rain. That's all I did. Harrison cut in. The photo was taken by your neighbor, Gerald Brennan. He recognized Ms. Rivers from an industry conference last year and thought it looked suspicious enough to report to our security team. They flagged it over the weekend, and corporate made the decision this morning. The room felt like it was shrinking. Daniel's hands gripped the arms of his chair. So you're firing me based on a photo and an assumption? 15 years, Richard. 15 years I've given this company. Every project on time. Every design solid. Every deadline met. And you're going to throw that away because I was a good Samaritan? Harrison's expression didn't change. It's not personal, Daniel. It's policy. We can't afford even the appearance of compromise. Daniel laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even him. Not personal. You're taking away my livelihood, my health insurance, everything I need to take care of my daughter. And you're saying it's not personal? Janet Morse pulled out a folder. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, continuation of benefits for 30 days, and a standard separation agreement. If you sign today, we can process everything quickly. Daniel stared at the folder like it was a snake. And if I don't sign, Harrison spoke up, then you receive nothing beyond your final paycheck, and we'll note in your file that you were terminated for cause. That'll make finding another position in this industry difficult. The threat was clear, wrapped in corporate language, but sharp as a blade. Sign away your right to fight this, or we'll make sure no one else will hire you either. Daniel thought about Sophie, about the college fund that was already too small, about the mortgage payment due next week. He thought about Sarah, about what she would tell him to do. And he knew. She'd tell him to fight, to stand up for himself, to refuse to let fear make him small. But Sarah wasn't here to help pay the bills or explain to their daughter why they might lose the house. He took the pen Janet offered and signed the agreement, each stroke of his name feeling like a betrayal of everything he believed in. "I need to clear out my desk," he said quietly. Harrison nodded. "You have until 5 p.m. Security will escort you out." The walk back to his desk felt like a funeral march. Co-workers glanced at him and quickly looked away, and he realized word had already spread. Jennifer from the design team, who he'd mentored for 3 years, suddenly became very interested in her computer screen. Paul, who he'd had lunch with twice a week for a decade, found an urgent reason to take a phone call. Even Sharon, the department secretary who always had a kind word, couldn't meet his eyes. He was already a ghost, erased from the social fabric of the place he'd spent 15 years of his life. He packed his personal items into a cardboard box someone had left by his desk, a few photos of Sophie, the world's best dad mug she'd made him in pottery class, the small succulent plant that had somehow survived 3 years of fluorescent lighting, his engineering notebooks, the ones filled with sketches and calculations for projects he'd poured himself into, had to stay. Company property, his designs, his innovations, his late nights and breakthrough moments, all of it belonged to TechFlow now, and he walked away with nothing but a box of personal trinkets and a severance check that wouldn't last 2 months. Security did escort him out, a young guy named Marcus, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. They rode the elevator down in silence, walked through the lobby where Daniel had entered confident and employed just 4 hours ago, and stepped out into a gray afternoon that matched his mood perfectly. Marcus awkwardly shook his hand by the parking lot. "For what it's worth, man, this is messed up. Everyone knows you're a straight shooter." Daniel managed a nod, got in his truck, and sat there for a long time before he trusted himself to drive. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, past the park where he and Sarah used to take Sophie when she was little, past the hospital where Sarah had spent her final days, past the cemetery where she was buried under an oak tree. He pulled into the cemetery parking lot and walked to her grave, standing there in the cold afternoon air, looking at the simple headstone. Sarah Fletcher, beloved wife and mother, the dates that bookended a life too short. "I messed up," he said aloud, his voice cracking. "I did exactly what you would have wanted, and it cost me everything. I don't know what to do now." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and a few late autumn birds called to each other in the distance, but there were no answers here. Just the weight of loss layered on top of loss, the feeling that he was failing both Sarah and Sophie by not being strong enough, smart enough, careful enough. He stayed until the cold seeped through his jacket, and he started shivering, then walked back to his truck, and finally drove home. Sophie was already there when he arrived. Early release day, something he'd completely forgotten about in the chaos. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and she looked up with a smile that died when she saw his face. "Dad? What's wrong?" He set the cardboard box down on the counter, and she saw the contents, the implications clicking into place. "You lost your job," she said quietly, not a question. He nodded, not trusting his voice yet. Sophie stood up and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug. She was almost as tall as his shoulder now. When had that happened? "It's going to be okay," she whispered, and he realized with a lurch that she was comforting him, this 12-year-old girl who shouldn't have to be the strong one. He pulled back and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the worry she'd been carrying for longer than he'd realized. "I need to tell you what happened," he said. And they sat down at the kitchen table while he explained it all, helping the woman, the photo, the accusations, the firing. He kept his voice steady, tried to present it as a setback rather than a catastrophe, but Sophie was smart enough to read between the lines. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Mom always told me to help people even when it's hard. You were just doing what she taught us." Her voice wavered on the word, Mom, and Daniel felt something break inside his chest. "Yeah, kiddo. I was." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "But I want you to know, we're going to be okay. I'm going to find another job, and until then, we'll figure it out. You don't need to worry." Even as he said it, he saw the skepticism in her eyes. The same look she'd given him that morning when he'd said they were fine. She was old enough now to know when adults were trying to protect her from the truth, and maybe that was part of the problem. He'd been so focused on shielding her from hardship that he'd forgotten she was already living through it, just from a different angle. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Daniel sat in his garage and let himself fall apart. The tears came hard and ugly, the kind of crying he hadn't allowed himself since Sarah's funeral, and with them came all the fear he'd been holding back. Fear of losing the house, of not being able to provide for Sophie, of failing as a father the way he felt he'd failed as a husband, by not somehow keeping Sarah alive. He cried until he was empty, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the smell of engine oil that always made him think of her. He must have fallen asleep in the chair because he woke hours later to the sound of the garage door opening. Sophie stood there in her pajamas, holding Sarah's old coffee mug, the one that still hung on the pegboard. "I heard you," she said softly. "I was scared you were sick or something." Daniel wiped his face, embarrassed to be caught like this. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a rough day." She walked over and handed him the mug. "Mom used to bring you coffee out here when you worked late. I thought maybe—" Her voice trailed off, and Daniel took the mug, feeling the weight of it, the chipped handle Sarah had refused to let him fix because she said it gave it character. "Thank you," he managed. Sophie sat down on the concrete floor beside his chair, leaning against his leg the way she used to when she was little. "I miss her," she said. "Every day I miss her." Daniel set the mug down and pulled his daughter close. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." They sat like that for a while, two people holding on to each other in a garage full of half-finished projects and memories, and somehow it helped. Not fixed, not better, but helped. "We're going to get through this," Daniel said, and this time he almost believed it. The next 2 weeks were a study in slow-motion crisis. Daniel filed for unemployment, updated his resume for the first time in 15 years, and started sending applications to every automotive company within a 50-mile radius. He applied to positions below his experience level, figuring he could work his way back up. But the rejection emails started coming almost immediately. Some were automated responses. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Others were more personal, and somehow those hurt worse because they meant someone had actually looked at his resume and decided he wasn't worth the risk. He called Harrison 3 times in the first week, swallowed his pride, and asked for at least a neutral reference, but the calls went straight to voicemail. The message was clear. TechFlow wanted nothing to do with him, and they were making sure everyone in the industry knew it. He heard through a former coworker that the official story was he'd been terminated for violation of confidentiality protocols, which was vague enough to sound damning without being specific enough to disprove. Money became a constant hum of anxiety in the background of everything. His emergency fund, which he'd always been so proud of maintaining, started hemorrhaging with frightening speed. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, Sophie's school expenses. It all added up faster than he'd anticipated. He started doing calculations in his head at odd moments, figuring out how many months he could last at current spending, how much he could cut without making Sophie's life noticeably worse. He switched to generic brands at the grocery store, started planning meals around what was on sale, let the thermostat drift a few degrees lower than comfortable. Sophie noticed. Of course she noticed. She stopped asking for things, stopped mentioning the school trip to the science museum, stopped talking about the new art supplies her teacher had recommended, stopped suggesting they order pizza on Friday nights the way they used to. It broke something in him to watch his daughter make herself smaller to fit inside his failures. One evening, he found her in her room going through her closet, pulling out clothes she'd outgrown. "What are you doing?" he asked from the doorway. She didn't look at him. "I thought maybe we could sell some stuff. I don't wear half of this anymore anyway." Daniel crossed the room and took the clothes from her hands. "Sophie, you don't need to do that." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But I want to help. I can't just sit here and watch you worry all the time. Mom wouldn't have wanted that either." He pulled her into a hug, feeling her shake with the effort of not crying. "Your job is to be 12 years old. My job is to worry about money. That's how it works." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. They were a team, just like he'd told her, and teams shared the burden. 3 weeks after losing his job, Daniel was washing dishes, one of the few household tasks that gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind spiraled, when his phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was listed as M. Rivers, and the subject line read simply, "A conversation." His first instinct was to delete it without reading. Whatever this was, it couldn't be good. But curiosity won out over caution, and he opened the message. It was brief and professional. "Mr. Fletcher, I recently learned about your termination from TechFlow. I had no intention of causing you any hardship by accepting your help that evening. I'd like to meet with you to discuss something that might interest you. If you're willing, please reply with a time that works. Respectfully, Morgan Rivers." Daniel read it 3 times, looking for the angle, the trap, the catch. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to avoid anything that might make an already complicated situation worse. But another part, the part that was watching his savings account dwindle toward zero and his daughter trying to sell her clothes, whispered that he couldn't afford pride right now. He stared at the email for a long time, then finally typed a short reply, suggesting Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, somewhere public and neutral. Her response came within an hour. "Thursday at 2, I'll be there. And Daniel, I'm truly sorry for what happened. That wasn't my intention." He didn't tell Sophie where he was going Thursday afternoon, just said he had a meeting about a possible job opportunity. She brightened at that, hugged him extra tight, and told him good luck with an earnestness that made his chest ache. The coffee shop was one of those modern places with exposed brick and too many plants, the kind where everyone seemed to be working on a laptop or having intense conversations over pour-over coffee. Morgan was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her. She stood when she saw him, offered a hand, and he shook it, feeling awkward and off balance. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." Daniel sat down, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup she pushed toward him. "Black, not to... No sugar." How did she know that? "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. She smiled slightly, a kind of rueful acknowledgement of the strangeness of this situation. "I owe you an apology. I had no idea that helping me would cost you your job. If I'd known..." He cut her off. "You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. TechFlow just saw what they wanted to see." Morgan nodded slowly, studying him with an intensity that was both uncomfortable and oddly respectful, like she was trying to see past his defenses to the person underneath. "I've known Richard Harrison for years. We've sat on industry panels together, competed for the same contracts. He's always been paranoid about competition, but this is excessive even for him." She paused, seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "After I found out what happened, I looked into your work. Your transmission designs are some of the most innovative in the industry. The adaptive system you developed 4 years ago revolutionized efficiency standards. And yet, I noticed something interesting when I checked the patent filings. She pulled out a tablet, slid it across the table. On the screen was a patent filing from 4 years ago. His adaptive transmission system, the one he'd spent 18 months developing, the one that had required countless late nights and weekends, the one Sarah had joked was his other child. But his name wasn't on it. TechFlow Automotive was listed as the sole inventor, with a small footnote mentioning contributions from engineering staff. Daniel stared at the document, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. I don't understand. I designed that. Every component, every adjustment, every innovation. That was me. Morgan leaned back in her chair. I know. I pulled the development records through some industry contacts. Your name is all over the internal memos and project files. But TechFlow has a policy. All patents developed on company time belong solely to the company, regardless of who created them. It's in the employment contract you signed 15 years ago, buried in Section 12, Paragraph 4. Daniel thought back to his hiring day, 22 years old and fresh out of engineering school, so grateful to have a job offer that he'd barely skimmed the contract before signing. That's legal? Morgan nodded. Unfortunately, yes. It's standard practice at a lot of companies, though not all of them are as aggressive about erasing individual contributions as TechFlow. She swiped to another screen, showing a list of patent filings over the past decade. They've done this to at least 6 other engineers I could identify. Brilliant people who developed groundbreaking systems, only to have their names stripped from the work before it was filed. Some of them left voluntarily once they realized what was happening. Others were fired under various pretenses, usually right before they would have been eligible for profit sharing or bonuses tied to patent licensing. Daniel felt sick. Why are you telling me this? Morgan met his eyes directly. Because I want to offer you a position at TechVantage. Lead engineer, full credit and ownership stake in any projects you develop, and a salary that actually reflects your value. But more than that, I want to help you get your name back on the work you created. Daniel set the tablet down carefully, his mind racing. If I take this job, it'll look exactly like what TechFlow accused me of. Like I was playing them all along. Like that night was some calculated move to get recruited by you. Morgan didn't deny it. To people who want to believe that, yes. But Daniel, I've been trying to recruit you for 2 years. I've sent you 3 email offers through LinkedIn, all of which went unanswered. I've had my HR director reach out twice through professional contacts, and you declined both times without even hearing the details. That night in the rain? That was pure coincidence. I was coming back from a conference downtown, my car died, and you happened to be the person who stopped to help. The only calculation involved was me realizing afterward that the kind man who refused payment for helping a stranger was exactly the kind of person I'd been trying to hire for years. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm not going to pressure you. Take time to think about it. But I need you to understand something. TechFlow didn't fire you because of our meeting. They fired you because you're too valuable, because you were starting to realize your worth, and because keeping you meant eventually having to give you credit for your innovations. Firing you was easier than treating you fairly. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, anger cutting through the fog of shame and confusion he'd been living in for weeks. They used me. 15 years, and they just used me. Morgan's voice was gentle. Yes. And I'm offering you a chance to build something different. Not perfect. No company is. But honest. When you create something at TechVantage, your name goes on it. When your work generates revenue, you share in the profits. When you have an idea, you get credit for it. The offer was generous, probably more than he deserved given his current situation, and yet the idea of taking it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. What if she was wrong? What if this was some elaborate setup? What if taking this job destroyed his reputation permanently? But then he thought about Sophie, about the pile of rejection emails in his inbox, about the mortgage payment due next week that he wasn't sure he could make. He thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made to her and to their daughter. And he realized that the only thing worse than taking a risk would be letting fear paralyze him into inaction while their lives fell apart. "I'd like to accept your offer," he said slowly, "but I have conditions." Morgan leaned forward, interested. "I'm listening." Daniel took a breath. "I want to fight TechFlow for the patent rights to my transmission system, not just for money, but because my name should be on my work. When Sophie's old enough to understand what I do, I want her to be able to look up that patent and see that her father created something important. And I need you to know that if I do this, people in this industry are going to assume the worst about both of us. They're going to say, I'm a corporate spy, that you're unethical, that this was all planned. I need to know you're prepared for that." Morgan's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened with what looked like respect. "Daniel, I've spent 20 years building this company. 20 years of people assuming I got where I am because of affirmative action, or because I slept with someone, or because I played dirty. I've been called every name you can imagine, had my credentials questioned, my decisions second-guessed, my victories attributed to luck or timing or anything except my actual competence. I stopped caring about those assumptions a long time ago, because the only opinions that matter are my own, and those of the people I respect." She leaned forward. "If you're ready to fight for what's yours, I've got lawyers who love this kind of case. If you're ready to build something new, I've got a team that will value you. And if you're ready to stop letting other people's fears dictate your choices, then welcome to TechVantage." They shook hands across the table, and Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence, but hope. A small flame of possibility that maybe, just maybe, this disaster could turn into something better. He left the coffee shop with Morgan's business card in his pocket, a start date in 2 weeks, and a weight lifted from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. The walk back to his truck felt lighter somehow, the gray November sky a little less oppressive. He called Sophie from the parking lot, and when she answered, he could hear the anxiety in her "hello" that made him realize how much of his stress she'd been absorbing. "I got a job, kiddo. A good one. We're going to be okay." The sound of her relief, the way she laughed and said, "I knew you would, Dad," made everything else worth it. He started at TechVantage 2 weeks later. The office was different from TechFlow, brighter, with large windows that let in actual sunlight, and an open floor plan that somehow still managed to give people privacy through clever use of partial walls and sound-dampening panels. Morgan introduced him to the engineering team, and he caught the looks, the whispers, people clearly trying to figure out what the story was with the new guy their CEO had personally recruited. But unlike TechFlow, where gossip was currency and reputation was everything, people here seemed more interested in what he could do than where he'd come from. Within a week, he was deep into a hybrid transmission project that utilized some of his old adaptive system concepts but pushed them in new directions. Within 2 weeks, he was leading design meetings and realizing that having his ideas actually listened to, actually valued, was intoxicating in a way he'd forgotten work could be. The legal battle with TechFlow took 4 months and was every bit as ugly as he'd expected. TechFlow's lawyers argued that Daniel had been an employee, that all his work was done on company time using company resources, that adding his name to the patent now would be rewriting history. Morgan's lawyers countered with development logs, internal emails where Daniel's colleagues explicitly credited him with breakthrough innovations, testimony from former TechFlow engineers who'd experienced the same erasure. The evidence was overwhelming, but TechFlow fought every step of the way, probably because admitting fault in his case would open them up to lawsuits from every other engineer they'd treated similarly. In March, A judge ruled in Daniel's favor, ordering TechFlow to either add his name to the patent as primary inventor or relinquish their claim entirely. They chose to add his name, probably because losing the patent would have cost them millions in existing licensing deals. But Daniel didn't care about their reasoning. He cared that when the updated patent filing came through, his name was there in black ink. Daniel Fletcher, primary inventor. He cared that Sophie could now pull up that patent online and see proof that her father had created something that mattered. He cared that he'd fought for himself and won. Something Sarah would have been proud of him for. Spring came slowly that year, but when it finally arrived, it felt earned. The anxiety that had been Daniel's constant companion since November began to fade, replaced by something steadier. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of rightness, of being where he was supposed to be. Sophie started sleeping better, stopped hoarding food in her room, stopped asking careful questions about money. The first time she mentioned wanting to try summer science camp without that hesitant, apologetic tone, Daniel signed her up immediately and paid the deposit without having to calculate how it would affect the budget. They could afford it now. More than that, they could afford for her to dream again, to be a kid again, to stop carrying the weight of adult worries on her 12-year-old shoulders. One evening in May, after a particularly good day at work where his design team had successfully tested a new gear ratio that improved efficiency by 12%, Daniel was in his garage working on the restored Mustang he'd picked up cheap from an estate sale. It needed everything: new engine mounts, transmission work, complete electrical rewiring, but that was part of the appeal. Fixing something broken, making it whole again, turning rust and neglect into something beautiful. He was lying under the chassis checking the exhaust system when he heard footsteps on the concrete floor. "Hand me that 3/4 socket wrench," he called out, assuming it was Sophie coming to watch him work the way she'd started doing lately, asking questions about what each tool did, how the different systems connected. But it wasn't Sophie. "I'm not sure which one that is," Morgan's voice said, and Daniel rolled out from under the car, surprised. She was standing in the doorway of his garage, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking around with obvious curiosity. "Sorry to just drop by. I was in the neighborhood and saw your light on." Daniel stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's fine. You're welcome anytime. Though I have to warn you, I'm not usually good company when I'm working on a project." She smiled. "Neither am I, which is why I wanted to stop by and say something before I lose my nerve." She walked over to the Mustang, ran a hand along its dusty hood. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Daniel frowned, confused. "For what? You're the one who gave me my career back." Morgan shook her head. "For reminding me why I do this." It's easy to get lost in the business side of things, the quarterly reports, the competitor analysis, the constant pressure to grow and innovate and beat everyone else. You helped me that night because it was the right thing to do. No calculations, no angle, no wondering what you'd get out of it. That's rare, Daniel. That kind of uncomplicated decency is so rare that it changed everything for both of us. Daniel leaned against his workbench, studying her. "You could have just sent me a thank you card." She laughed. "I could have. But I wanted to see this." She gestured around the garage, at the half-restored Mustang, at Sarah's coffee mug still hanging on the pegboard, at the Chevy engine that still sat unfinished on the workbench after 3 years. This is who you are when nobody's watching, when there's no pressure to perform or impress. This is what matters to you, and it tells me I made the right decision hiring you, because someone who spends their free time fixing things that are broken is someone who understands what really matters. She turned to face him fully. "I built TechVantage because I was tired of watching brilliant people get erased. Tired of seeing innovation attributed to companies instead of the individuals who created it. Tired of talent being exploited and used up and discarded. That night, Standing in the rain watching you fix my car for no reason, except that I needed help. I remembered why I started. You gave me that, whether you meant to or not." Daniel didn't know what to say. The gratitude was genuine, he could see that, but it felt disproportionate to what he'd done. "I was just being decent," he said finally. Morgan nodded. "Exactly." "That's my point." They talked for a while longer, about the Mustang's restoration timeline, about Sophie's summer plans, about a new project Morgan wanted his input on. Eventually, she said goodbye and drove away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and his half-finished projects. He looked around the garage, seeing it fresh through her eyes. This space had been his refuge after Sarah died, the place where he could control outcomes and fix problems and make sense of chaos. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. It had become a reminder that creating things, fixing things, helping things work better, that was what gave his life meaning beyond just surviving. Sophie appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, holding 2 cans of soda. "Was that your boss?" Daniel took the offered drink. "Yeah." She wanted to say thanks. Sophie hopped up onto the workbench, her legs swinging. "She seems nice. Different than how you described your old boss." Daniel thought about that. She is different. She actually listens when people talk, values what they contribute. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" He nodded, bracing himself. "Do you think Mom would be proud of you? For fighting back when they fired you? For taking the new job? For everything?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He thought about Sarah, about her fierce protectiveness of the people she loved, about her belief that good people deserved good things, and that injustice should be confronted, not accepted. "I think she would have been furious at TechFlow and proud that I didn't just let them win. But honestly, Sophie, I think she'd be most proud that I didn't let losing that job make me stop being the person she married, the person who helps people, the person who still believes decency matters." Sophie smiled, that particular smile that reminded him so much of her mother. It hurt. "Good, because I'm proud of you too." Summer arrived with its long evenings and the smell of cut grass, and Sophie's excited chatter about science camp projects. Daniel threw himself into the hybrid transmission project at TechVantage, working closely with a team that actually felt like a team, people who bounced ideas off each other, who celebrated each other's breakthroughs, who gave credit where it was due. His name went on design documents, on presentations, on patent applications. Every time he saw Daniel Fletcher, lead engineer, on something, he felt a small surge of validation, a reminder that his contributions mattered and would be remembered. On a Friday in July, exactly 8 months after the night he'd helped a stranger in the rain, Daniel was closing up his garage when he heard that familiar sound, an engine clicking, failing to turn over. He looked up and saw a young man standing beside an old Honda, phone in hand, frustration written across his face. For just a second, Daniel hesitated. The last time he'd stopped to help someone, it had cost him his job, his financial security, his peace of mind. But then he thought about Sophie's question. Would Sarah be proud? And he knew the answer. He grabbed his toolbox and walked over. "Do you need help?" The young man looked surprised, then grateful. "Battery's dead, I think. I've got jumper cables but no other car around." Daniel smiled. "Lucky for you, I've got both." While they waited for the battery to charge, the young man introduced himself as Tyler, said he was on his way home from his first day at a new job, said he was nervous about living up to expectations. Daniel asked him about the job, listened to his concerns, and eventually said, "You'll do fine. Just remember that you're there because someone saw something valuable in you. Don't let anyone make you forget that." It was advice he wished someone had given him 15 years ago, advice he'd learned the hard way. The car started, and Tyler thanked him profusely, tried to offer gas money or buy him coffee sometime. Daniel waved him off the same way he had with Morgan, with that same tired smile. Just pass it on when you can. He watched Tyler drive away, then turned back to his house where the lights were on, and Sophie was probably sprawled across the couch reading or watching science videos. The air smelled like rain coming, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking, and everything felt so beautifully, impossibly normal. He'd been fired for fixing a stranger's car for free, and it had led him here, to a better job, a clearer sense of himself, a life that felt more honest and more his own than anything he'd had before. Inside, Sophie was exactly where he'd imagined. Textbooks spread around her on the living room floor, pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up when he came in. "You helped someone again, didn't you?" He hung his keys on the hook by the door. "How'd you know?" She grinned. "You've got that look." "The one Mom used to talk about." Daniel crossed the room and kissed the top of her head. "What look is that?" Sophie's voice was soft but certain. "The one that means you remembered who you are." That night, after Sophie went to bed, Daniel stood in his garage and let himself think about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the unexpected grace of second chances, the strange way that losing everything had somehow given him back himself. He ran his hand along the Mustang's hood, smooth now where it had been rusted before, and thought about transformation, how sometimes things have to be broken down completely before they can be rebuilt into something better. He thought about Morgan, about how a random act of decency had connected two people who needed each other in ways neither of them had expected. He thought about Tyler, about passing forward the kindness he'd received, about the ripples of goodness that spread outward when people chose decency over convenience. He turned off the garage light and walked back into his house, into the soft glow of the kitchen where tomorrow's coffee was already set to brew and Sophie's science project supplies were spread across the counter. The rain started then, gentle at first, then stronger, drumming on the roof like a heartbeat, like a reminder that some storms wash things away and others wash them clean. Daniel Fletcher had been fired for fixing a stranger's car for free, and it had cost him everything he thought he needed: the security, the stability, the comfortable certainty of a life that made sense. But it had given him back something he'd forgotten he'd lost, the knowledge that character wasn't about never being tested, but about what you did when everything fell apart. He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made to keep fixing things, to keep being the person she'd loved. He'd kept that promise even when it cost him, and somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. The right choice and the easy choice were rarely the same, and he'd learned that the hard way. But he'd also learned that there was freedom in choosing right over easy, in standing up for who you were, even when the world tried to punish you for it. In the end, that was worth more than 15 years of safety could ever be. That was the lesson he wanted Sophie to learn, the legacy he wanted to leave her. Not perfection or invincibility, but the courage to stay decent in an indecent world, to help people even when it cost you something, to believe that goodness still mattered even when it looked like goodness lost. And standing in his kitchen on a rainy July night, with his daughter asleep upstairs, and a job that valued him, and a life that felt true again, Daniel Fletcher finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him in those last months. The light you gave to the world would eventually find its way back to you, not always when you expected it, or in the form you anticipated, but always, always worth the cost of keeping it burning. He'd lost almost everything by being the person she'd taught him to be, but in losing it, he'd found something better. He'd found himself, and that, in the end, was worth everything.